Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. I'm pleased to welcome Cliff Willming to Wider View. Cliff is an activist, and I asked him to introduce himself to the Wider View audience.
For one, welcome. Thank you for having me. And yes, again, my name is Cliff Willming. I'm a registered nurse. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and recently authored the article, I'll Tell You Why the 99% Isn't Revolting.
Thanks, Cliff. As you probably know, Wider View focuses primarily on foreign affairs. But, we have major protests against cuts in social services and neoliberal policies, with huge numbers of people in the streets day after day all around the world, right now in Lebanon, France, Haiti, Ecuador, and Chile. But not here, not in the United States. Never here. Why is that?
It's kind of the question of the hour, really. And, the U.S. really, in my experience, and I should emphasize, too, that, I'm not a paid activist or a paid commentator. Again, I'm a registered nurse. I just happen to spend a lot of time in very grassroots social struggles, movements, environmental efforts. I did a lot of time in Colorado fighting the oil and gas industry out there and fracking. I was up there at Standing Rock. And also I'm a union RN and have had a long history of rank and file labor fights. And really, that's the question of the hour. I mean, you see the entire globe almost moving into defiant action, as you suggested, in Ecuador and Chile and Haiti and Barcelona as well.
Right.
And you don't see that in the United States. And, the question is, why don't you see that? Is it because of some kind of character defect in the American people? Is it because things are going so great here for everybody? Are there more sophisticated forces in place to make sure that those types of explosions don't take place? That really risk a very predictable and reliable business order for the United States. Mm-hmm. And my contention is that it's the latter, that there are actual organizations and institutions formulated to keep social revolt from happening, although they're almost always masked or cloaked in a degree of concern about viable or important social issues themselves. That's mm-hmm. being a little vague, but...
Well, Cliff, we can drill down a little bit on that. You had a recent article on the website Wrong Kind of Green that gave 3 reasons why protest movements fizzle out here in the U.S. And the first one you talked about was the nonprofit industrial complex. So tell us what you mean by that term and what they're doing that saps the power of movements.
This is, I can talk a little bit about my experience, but there's nothing unique about what I experienced in that fight there in Colorado for the environment, or a lot of other formulations. I mean, I should also say that I was out there in Seattle in 1999 with the World Trade Organization protests. And that to me looked a lot more like real rebellion or resistance. But regardless of where, either myself, I've applied to conducting some kind of transformation or addressing some degree of injustice, or other people. Yes, what is particularly unique about the United States is this entire social formulation of the not-for-profits. And these organizations, they can be funded. They tend to fall out of the sky if you're there in the grassroots, real mm-hmm. frontline efforts. These not-for-profits seem to appear out of nowhere. And when you're a grassroots fighter like that, their presence can be very intriguing and somewhat charismatic or convincing, because a lot of these not-for-profits are significantly funded. They have staff. they have experience, they have social networks, they somehow have a lot of connection to local political officials or national political officials. They have access to media. They are given profile on a national scale. And so, when grassroots movements, really rise up to address some inconsistency with, what they're experiencing, and it doesn't matter whether it's, Lafayette, Colorado fighting Extraction Oil and Gas Company, or if it's the people in Ferguson, Missouri, fighting racist police brutality. The not-for-profits will move into those struggles. They have a very clear role and methodology to jump in front of the issue and to commandeer its concern and to route that into venues that are, although seem reasonable and authoritative, are otherwise politically inert. And this can take on any kind of form. I mean, whether it's telling communities that you can't ban fracking, or whether it's telling communities that their role should be pinned on the outcome of the next hearing or the next task force or committee, or electing the next Democrat to offer. What the not-for-profits do is defang movements, and they do it very efficiently, and they've been practiced at it for about 40 or 50 years since the invention of professional activism.
Right. Well, I happen to recall having been in New York City in July and August of 2014, prior to the big climate march that was held there in September, with Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein et al. And every time I would ride in the subway, every car of the subway had 2 or 3 color posters advertising the rally and that people should come out for this big climate rally. And I thought to myself, this doesn't look like normal activism. I mean, I don't know any activist that can afford to plaster ads all over the New York subways for months.
Well, the climate stuff is most egregious with that sort of thing. A lot of the companies supporting what is considered climate concerns are the same corporations that are drilling for oil. Shell Oil, British Petroleum. I mean, all of those major corporations have foundation grants that they create. And it's interesting that something as existentially threatening as the killing of the global climate itself could somehow be championed by the very people that are killing it off is pretty indicative of how that works. But it shows you how sophisticated it is and how casually Orwellian those kind of formulations can be.
In the article on Wrong Kind of Green, a website I strongly recommend, by the way, the article is accompanied by an image of a tweet showing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez announcing her Green New Deal. And the tweet had been originated by a group called the Natural Capital Coalition.
Rings like a bell, doesn't it?
Apparently, the goal of the coalition is to assign a monetary value to nature.
They've been doing that for quite some time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you could go on, but Ocasio-Cortez recently went to the area of Colorado where I lived, particularly Boulder County and Broomfield County, which is on the front line of the Wattenberg oil shale. There's in Colorado, there's over 50,000 oil and gas wells that have been drilled, primarily by the Democratic Party, with cooperation with the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, and then the big greens like the Sierra Club and Conservation Colorado and League of Oil Impacted Colorado Communities. And there's a bunch of these things. But, Ocasio-Cortez went out to Colorado not to stop fracking, nor to draw a light to the disastrous policy known as the new energy economy that essentially built the oil and gas industry out there. But Ocasio-Cortez went to Colorado to raise money for the Democratic Party. So, and of course, the Democratic Party controls the legislative House and the Senate and the governor's office. So no oil and gas permit exists except for the signature of the Democratic Party today, the same institution that Ocasio-Cortez was out there providing political legitimacy for. So yeah, it's a very tight-knit group, and the bait and switch is they've got a lot of dexterity behind it. But yes, a lot of times what you see and what you get are two very different things. And a lot of times you can sense this out by simply asking the question: who is the authoritative decision maker in a lot of these formulations? And with the climate march, and what was the name of the foundation that?
The Natural Capital Coalition.
Yeah, the National Capital Coalition. I'm sure that they don't operate in a democratic way. And as far as I can tell, the Green New Deal itself is really the authoritative body to that. Right now, it's just a resolution, but it's 15 appointed individuals onto a climate committee. So in a nation of over 330 million people, you've got 15 people that are going to claim authority to rewrite the economy and all other aspects of society. So it's not even the 1%; it's the 0.0001% that's at the steering wheel of that.
Right. Let's focus on the Democratic Party for a moment. I had Margaret Kimberly of the Black Agenda Report on the program recently, and she says that the Democratic Party is the place movements go to die. And you say that the more ties that a movement has with the Democratic Party, the more predictable and inert the rebellion will become. Maybe you can explain why.
Sure. For one, a lot of times what a lot of people want to say is if you're not for the Democratic Party or you have significant criticisms of the Democratic Party, you have to be a Republican, which is frankly bullshit. I'm a socialist and a working class member of no organization at this point at all. But yet the Democratic Party, the interesting components of the Democratic Party is it was the capitalist party that was in power during the last major social upheavals, which was the anti-war movement in the 60s, the civil rights movement in the 60s, and the labor movement in the 1930s. And so the Democratic Party was able to, or forced to, establish mechanisms by which to ingratiate those movements to the political system so as to remove them from their most serious threats to that system. So while the Republican Party was kind of, to some degree, on the sidelines during those times, the Democratic Party owned the White House, a large chunk of the Congress. And so the Democratic Party had to develop mechanisms by which to ingratiate itself to these movements so that it could put them to sleep. Today, you'll hear the Democratic Party espousing a lot of the concessions that those grassroots movements forced onto it against its will. A lot of times, after a series of violent events between the National Guard or police and workers or protesters, pretty routinely. And so the Democratic Party they have a better game now. And when grassroots efforts or struggles pop up, the Democratic Party is the more credible of the two Wall Street parties to attach itself to those movements so as to drain them of life and to make sure to get ahead of its ideas and strategies to keep it dulled and routine and predictable. There's a lot of working class people out there that'll point out the fact that the Republican Party is quite obvious in its contempt for working people or the 99%. I agree with that all the way. But if you look at anything. The union movement, the labor movement has given itself to the Democratic Party for 50 straight years. For 50 straight years, our role as rank and file unionists has really been to either support, lobby, give donations to, or get out and knock doors for Democratic Party politicians. And for 50 years, you have seen a consistent, terrible retreat in the working conditions and the living conditions of working class people. You've seen a gutting of the unions. And you've seen, because of this, because we've become so obedient to the Democratic Party instead of turning to the things historically that have really built the victories that resulted in programs like Social Security and minimum wage and other workplace protections. We've become so predictable that the Democratic Party really just looks at the union movement as their ATM these days.
Right.
And, over the last 20 years, I think it's documented that the union movement has given the Democratic Party over $1 billion. And what is it, let's look at it in terms of how a nurse would look at our practice. I mean, if my practice as a nurse resulted in 50 years of patient mortality, it would be reasonable for somebody to question what the hell I'm doing. But what you're not seeing, in the union movement in the United States right now, is an organized questioning of that as a strategy, which could potentially lead to the formation of real worker organizations that are independent of those two political parties.
Well, yeah, and I to me, the thing, we have only two political parties, and amplified by the media, there are only two opinions on any topic. That either you are on the blue team or the red team, and if you say anything against the blue team, then you're helping the red team, and so forth. And it's a great way to cut off debate. It's a great way to make sure that no dangerous ideas come forward. Would you agree?
Yeah. I mean, it's a multiple choice question with two potential answers, both that are completely and totally run by corporations.
Right.
And it's interesting too. I think that it's important to point out that, the American working class has not been politically inert throughout our history. And if it had, there would be no reason for these structures like the NGOs or the dominance of the union leadership or the Democratic Party to even exist. Mm-hmm. It's really the fact that rank and file rebellion or grassroots rebellion from below was so commonplace, had been so commonplace in U.S. history that these mechanisms had to be invented. And what you get in terms of how our political role as regular people is described, it's like, yes, you can either root for the red team or the blue team, and that's it. It's completely divorced from any historical fact about how any real change has ever taken place. And, I talk a little bit about what movements looked like in the past that were behind those times of significant change. And in every case, those movements, not in one single case, whether it's the abolitionists or the civil rights movements or the labor movements, did they ever start out by saying, we need to support one of these two political parties? Not in one single instance. It was really through building political power from below, and not only building that power, but utilizing that power, occupying factories, creating boycotts, really threatening the system with a process of civilian empowerment that threatened to get out of control, where the system was forced to create these kind of concessions. So, yeah, it seems a little bit like gaslighting when people are told, if you don't support the Democrats, you're basically an agent of the Republican Party, or, maybe now these days the Russians again. So we've come.
Well, you're either helping the Russians or Trump, and for many people, they're one and the same. One of the statements in your article is that movements understand that injustice is not an accidental or a coincidental outcome of the political system, but the system working as it was intended. I see a lot of movements that are directed toward begging politicians or even making demands of politicians in Washington that they be more just, that they do the right thing for workers. But that does not seem to be working.
Well, no. You can apply this model to just about anything. And we're there to make a moral plea to a system that's DNA is based on exploitation of people and the environment. Which is, I think that's where, the not-for-profits and the Democrats and oftentimes the union leaders move from simple misleadership into outright dishonesty. Because, the Sierra Club that has an operating budget of somewhere around $100 million, they know how the environmental law works, for example. And so what you'll get, the Sierra Club will absolutely say that you need to go to these hearings, that you need to have your voice heard, that you need to appeal, the permit for the line 3 or the extraction project, there in Broomfield, Colorado, or in line 5 or the Dakota Access Pipeline. And the thing is that, the entire environmental law, no different than labor law, was written to define the terms of the exploitation. Mm-hmm. And so it has absolutely nothing to do with your moral appeal. In other words, all of those hearings and all of those task force and all of those committees are not legally mandated to do anything with your moral appeal whatsoever. They are mandated to at least conduct a hearing, though. Right. So, the dog and pony show is mandated, but the conclusions that the dog and pony show draw out, in other words, people don't want a project, are totally outside of the law. Mm-hmm. And so, when we look at movements in history, no movement thought that, if a movement, for example, if the auto workers in the 1930s felt that General Motors could be swayed by a moral appeal, there would have been no reason to occupy the factories. And if the civil rights movement thought that the Jim Crow South was open to a moralistic argument, there would have been no reason for boycotts. And so in every case, these movements identify the problem at its systematic source. It's a systemic source. And throughout that, when they do find that source, they organize ways to break, invalidate, discredit, and otherwise make that immoral law unenforceable. And the moment those political forces outweigh the forces that need that law in place, we get systemic change. Mm-hmm. And that is not something that you're going to get from any of these formulations today. And it's consequently the success of those the ability of those formulations to keep us away from drawing those conclusions that Chicago doesn't look like Quito, Ecuador.
Right. Well, I agree with you totally on that one. We're in the middle of a long presidential campaign season now, and most of the energy of progressives and others who are fighting for justice is going to be directed toward supporting more progressive candidates in the Democratic primaries in the hope they'll make it to the general election. Is this a productive use of their time and energy? Should progressives be working on things like this, or just ignoring it and doing something else?
Well, I think it's almost the question of the hour. For one, I don't think that real grassroots fighters have the luxury to totally ignore ruling class elections, because when we do that, we kind of we cede those venues to the 1%. Mm-hmm. And but on the same token, we have to understand what our role is in those elections in a lot more thoughtful and a lot more mature of a way. I was just looking at terms of like campaign spending, which is a lot of Democratic politicians love to bring attention to. And, the unions in 2016 spent over, I think, $216 million on that election. The Bernie Sanders campaign alone raised over $280 million for a presidential election.
Mm-hmm. Only for the primary.
Right. That was only for the primary. And, we're not even getting into the other candidates or, all of the other elections that money poured into. And, if you think about it, in other countries, mass organizations that are fully staffed, that are organized from on a local level, that understand that the system, that the problems they're facing are systemic, and that begin to organize working class people to break those offending laws. They take place globally. And, what I have always said is that, I don't feel that we should abandon electoral politics, but we should look at electoral politics as a function of building the grassroots movement rather than what they're given to us as, which is this fantasy that the solutions to our problems are somehow going to come from above. And that's just never historically been the case. But when we were there in Lafayette, we ran our own candidates. I ran for Boulder County Commissioner as a socialist and a union RN, got 13,000 votes in a significantly, terrifyingly Democratic county of Boulder. And actually, my mom ran as an independent as well and got a Lafayette City Council seat. But those elections were qualitatively different than what we get today, because what we said is, as an elected official, we can't fix the problem by ourselves, but we can use the campaign to fight for the ideas, and we can use the office to build the resistance from below. Mm-hmm. And that is a very different way of looking at electoral politics. And, I have always said that the unions shouldn't be pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into the Democratic Party, that we should be building a real organization that can call strikes, run our own candidates, and, fight for our issues in a much more decisive and organized way, which I think is vastly different than the branding of electoral politics we're given today.
Yeah, I think you're right. So I finished all my questions. Is there anything you'd like to add?
For one, thank you for having me on your show. I know that that there's a lot of material here.
Yes.
And I wrote that article. I was happy that Popular Resistance printed it. I think that these kind of questions or these ideas are going to become much more sharp in the future. Mm-hmm. And I want to add very specifically that it's not the end of times. The minute somebody starts to criticize the not-for-profits and the Democratic Party and the role of the union leadership, it's really the start of a movement that is characterized by those kind of questions. Right. And, the fact of the matter is that we can change this world, and we can build something big and defiant and linked to all of those international uprisings that we listed, but we can't do that while we've chained ourselves to the anchor of these formulations from yesterday.
So what we're tying ourselves to here is corporate-funded, 1% funded mechanisms to control the debate between the Democratic Party, the labor union leaders, and the NGOs. Partnering with polluters is not going to solve the climate problem, and partnering with those who are unjust is not likely to bring justice. Cliff, I think what you've said here is very important, and I thank you for taking the time to be on Wider View.
Okay, thanks again, Charles.
Sure. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Thanks again to Cliff Willming for joining me this week on Wider View. As always, the views expressed here are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of the radio station to which you're listening. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thank you for listening.